And welcome everybody. It's really lovely to see you all, and I'm sure you're really looking forward to Dr. Evelina Galaczi's talk on a communicative approach to language assessment, principles and practice. I promise not to keep you too long. I've just got a couple of bits of housekeeping and then a little introduction to the MST in English language assessment before handing over to Dr. Evelina Galaczi. So housekeeping first. This session is being recorded, and so you're welcome to go back and revisit it at any time. Our lovely colleagues in marketing will be sending a link once the recording is processed to everyone who has registered for the event. We do want this to be an interactive event. We do want you to ask questions. So please use the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom, normally the bottom of your screen, sometimes at the top. We will answer all questions after the presentation and collate them together. You'll notice some of the chat function is disabled. You won't be able to chat to one another. It'll primarily be used for my lovely colleague Amy to post useful links, and if there's ever any questions asked, and it will specifically say post in the chat, but please use the Q&A for questions. So who are we? Welcome to the University of Cambridge Institute of Continuing Education. The University of Cambridge is an 800-year-old global institution with a history of innovation and leadership. And one of its major missions really is to share its research with the world. Within the university, the Institute of Continuing Education, or ICE, has as its mission trying to make the university's research as accessible as possible to as many different people as possible. And we were founded back in 1868 by Professor James Stewart. And 150 years later, that's what we're still doing. We design, deliver and curate a portfolio of short courses and award-bearing undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications. And we're also the admitting and awarding body for all Master of Studies, MST, part-time degrees within the university. So why English language assessment? Well, I'm sure part of the reason you're here means that you know the answer to this, but there is an expanding need for English language assessment globally, and it's becoming ever more important to share the best practice. And at Cambridge, we're really fortunate to be at the very cutting edge of research and experience in the field. And the MST itself is aimed at English language teachers and other educational practitioners and professionals seeking to enhance and consolidate their knowledge in English language assessment. And what we're really excited about is this anticipation of a global cohort sharing different perspectives and experiences, and thereby gaining first-hand understanding of the challenges of language assessment in different contexts and cultures. So I've spoken a little bit about ICE and a little bit about the MST in English language assessment, but it's a partnership course within the university. It's delivered jointly by Cambridge Language Sciences Interdisciplinary Research Centre, hereafter known as IRC, and by Cambridge Assessment English, with input from the Institute of Automated Language Teaching and Assessment, ALTA. And so the whole course offers a unique combination of cross-disciplinary expertise. So the IRC, for those who don't know, Cambridge Language Sciences is a virtual research centre at the University of Cambridge, and it was set up in 2011 and based within theoretical and applied linguistics. And its mission is to bring together language researchers from different academic disciplines to develop new collaborations. And that bringing together of researchers, it's worth noting that the university is regularly ranked, routinely tops the National University League tables for linguistics. And so the staff include many researchers considered world experts in the field. And as part of the MST, students will have a visible profile on the Language Sciences website, so it will be part of that research community. And interdisciplinarity has generally informed the development of the new MST, which will offer excellent theoretical and empirical research in a broad spread of fields. So moving on to Cambridge Assessment, I'm sure needs no introduction to most people, but it's a world leader in assessment in educational contexts. And Cambridge Assessment English specifically is a group within Cambridge Assessment and the global leader in English language assessment. It provides exams in English for speakers of other languages, which are taken by over 5 million candidates worldwide each year, as well as providing the leading range of qualifications for language teachers. It uses cutting-edge educational technology based on the use of digital data and devices for language education. So now is a perfect point for me to move on to our speaker for today. Dr. Evelina Galaczi is Head of Research Strategy at Cambridge Assessment English and leads a team of experts in language learning, teaching and assessment. Following her study at Columbia University, She has worked in language education for over 25 years and now oversees the development and implementation of the Cambridge English Research Strategy. So without further ado, I will hand over to Evelina. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zara. I always feel so proud whenever I hear about in the introduction about my institution, which is Cambridge English, Cambridge Assessment, the University of Cambridge. It really is a world leader, and we're very happy to be working with you today, our global audience, in introducing you a little bit about the work that we do. Before I start, Zara, can I ask for the chat function to be enabled? Is that possible? Just because I wanted a little bit of interaction with some tasks. Would that be okay? So as Zara said, put your Q&A, put your specific questions that we are going to come back to at the end of the lecture in the Q&A function. But if you can enable the chat, then I'm going to have a few tasks. The response you should go in the chat. If that's
perfect.
Thank you so much. Okay. So the topic we chose today is quite a broad topic, but really it is a fundamental topic to what language assessment is about. And the topic is a communicative approach to language assessment, principles and practice. And I would like to start with a task for you. I'm a teacher. I used to teach for many, many years, and I believe that the best learning is through getting you to engage with it without me giving you answers. So I'm launching off the lecture with a task. And the task is this question: what does communicative language assessment mean for you? Now, I'm going to show you 3 examples of tests, and I would like you to tell me whether each of these tasks is communicative for you. Now, there's no right and wrong answer here. It's just trying to gauge how you understand communicative language assessment. Okay, so here is the first task. And the question is this task communicative? This is task A. You have a set of pictures, and the prompt tells you that a young businessman wants to find an activity to help him relax. So that's the young businessman looking a little bit stressed out at his job in the middle. Here's a picture with some ideas to help you. Some other ideas are given that this person can do to relax. Talk with your partner about the different activities and give some suggestions. So this is a speaking task in a pair. You need to talk to your partner. Now, just in the chat box, tell me, is this task communicative or not? Yes or no? Just type in the chat box. I cannot, okay, let me just, all right, okay, I'm getting lots of yeses, fantastic. Yes, so it's a speaking task, interaction between 2 participants. Oh, there's somebody says it's not very communicative. We can come back to that later. Okay, so let's now move on to another task. You see an announcement on an English language website. And the announcement says that articles are wanted on a topic, music and me. So there's some questions, and the task is to write an article answering these questions. The best articles will be posted on a website. Write your article. So this is a writing task, which involves writing an article. Is this task communicative? What do you think? Okay, I'm getting some yeses. Not as many people are eager to respond now. I think this is a little bit more challenging. Someone says partly communicative. It depends on definition of communicative, and someone else says not very. We'll come back to that. I would like to explore your thoughts on why you thought it's not very communicative afterwards. Okay, one more task. This is the final one. This is a task that involves a list of words, and some are actual English words, some are nonsense English words. And this actually task is taken from an actual language test, not a Cambridge test, a different test. But the question for you is this task communicative? You have to choose the real English words from this list. Okay, lots of people are saying no, not really. From Lucy, yes, a lot of people are saying no. And actually, I agree with you. I would say the first 2 tasks are communicative. Of course, it depends on the definition. We'll talk about that later. This task isn't. Now, let's think a little bit about this. What is it that defines communicative language assessment? What is it that makes tasks 1 and 2 communicative, but not the third one? And I would say that the most succinct definition of communicative language assessment is about using language in authentic tasks. Now, these can be learning tasks or assessment tasks, but the idea is that they are authentic, and authentic means they are encountered in real life. They're not just used in the classroom, not just part of a textbook. And communicative also means that grammar and vocabulary are used within a real life context. In other words, you don't do grammar just for the sake of doing grammar tasks. You don't do vocabulary just for the sake of vocabulary, but you're using those building blocks of language to accomplish reading, listening, speaking, and writing. So this is what communicative language assessment is about. And importantly, it is not just about speaking, okay? It is about using language in an authentic way, in a real life way. Before we talk a little bit more about communicative language assessment, I just want to show you how we got here, what preceded communicative language assessment. So this is a very, very, very quick whistle-stop tour of how ideas in language assessment evolved and how we got to communicative language assessment. So in the 1890s, the predominant methodology in teaching and in testing was the grammar translation method. It's quite self-explanatory what this really means in the title. So the focus here was on reading. So that was the main skill that was being developed. And within that, really, the focus was on grammar, lexis, and syntax. It wasn't about communication. It wasn't about real life reading. It was really about developing very strong knowledge in grammar, lexis, syntax through reading. And this is an example of 3 sentences that if you were learning English in a grammar translation method, you would have had to translate. So you might have this in English, translate in your own language or vice versa. So here's one sentence. The philosopher pulled the lower jaw of the hen. My sons have bought the mirrors of the Duke. The cat of my aunt is more treacherous than the dog of your uncle. Now, clearly, these are not very authentic sentences. Clearly, these are not sentences that we would be using in a normal environment on a regular basis. But the point of these sentences was that they helped you develop in-depth sophistication with using grammar and vocabulary. Okay, so the focus was on grammar and vocabulary. That was the grammar translation method. 1913, another milestone, and this is actually a Cambridge milestone that we're very proud of. The Certificate of Proficiency in English test was released, and it was a communicative speaking test. Still very much grammar translation in many other aspects, but it had a communicative speaking component, which was completely revolutionary at the time. So the speaking component consisted of half hour of dictation and half hour of conversation and reading. So the conversation was very new, and it focused on an interaction between the examiner and the test taker. So some movement toward communicative. 1960s was the audiolingual approach. That was the predominant methodology in teaching. It was based on behaviorist theory. So it was the first method that was actually based on a theory, and it was about stimulus response. Lots of drills, in other words, and lots of memorization, because that's what the theory believed language learning is about, that it's all about memorization and developing a response to a specific stimulus. So 1960s in teaching, this was the approach. The corresponding approach in language assessment was the psychometric era. Now, psychometric means very precise measurement of something that is hidden. And in this case, multiple choice was used very widely, and objectivity of measurement was the ultimate goal. Now, if objectivity of measurement is your ultimate goal, then it means that skills such as speaking and writing are not going to be part of your test, because they cannot be measured as objectively as a multiple choice test of reading and listening can be measured. So this was very much about multiple choice. And then we come in the 1980s to the communicative approach. So going through these stages, which was really about language use with real life purposes, and test authenticity was the focus here. So that's very, very quickly to give you a sense of where the communicative language approach came from and how it evolved. So we've talked a little bit about what it is. And in assessment terms, communicative language ability is the test construct. Now, a test construct is a fundamental concept in language assessment. It is about what you're trying to measure. So language assessment is all about measuring constructs. And constructs are typically latent, that means unobservable traits, something that is a cognitive process, not necessarily something that can be directly observed. So for example, reading comprehension is a construct. Fluency in speaking is a construct that is a little bit more directly observable. Interactional competence is a construct. So this is what we do. We measure constructs, and in language assessment, we can measure communicative language assessment as a communicative language ability as a construct as well. So we measure a construct, something that is hidden, latent, unobservable, and then we have to make inferences about that construct, because we cannot measure the full range of instances of ability in that construct. So we measure an instance of the construct. So this is really how it would be very useful to think about communicative language ability, but also how we measure it. So we can measure a sample of language use, which would be communicative language use. So reading, listening, speaking, writing, a sample of that. But really, we're doing that so that we can generalize to overall language use, which we cannot see. That's the shadow in the picture. That's something that we have to make an inference about. And because that generalization is so important, it is really, really, really critical to get the right sample from the right test, so that we can then be precise in the generalization that we make to the overall language use. So very important to get the right sample, which means you need to develop tasks which give you access to communicative language ability, tasks which give you the ability to tap into that and see how well a test taker can manage. So construct validity, we talked about constructs, and it really is about the fundamental question in language assessment connected to constructs is, does the test measure what it is supposed to measure? So for example, if you take a driving test, does that test measure your ability to drive on quiet streets, to drive on A roads, and to drive on motorways? That's what it's, does it measure what it's supposed to measure? It is about, and that question is about construct validity. So our construct is communicative language ability, and a test needs to have tasks that elicit communicative language ability in order to have construct validity. Now let's take a look at tasks. Let's take a look at what you can actually put in a test and see whether that's a communicative test. I'm going to give you an example from a reading test. And I've chosen reading because speaking is the obvious choice when it comes to communicative, but I want you to think about a skill that is not typically seen as communicative, but actually it is, because the question always is, what examples of this do we find in real life? So obviously we do a lot of reading in real life, so reading is part of a communicative test. But let's think about what kind of reading, what are we actually measuring when we say reading test? So I'm going to give you a passage to read, and I'm going to ask you to answer 4 questions about it. Please give your answers in the chat box. All right, so 4 questions. I want you to give your answers in the chat box. And we're thinking about validity. So we're going to talk about this a little bit later. So here is the passage I would like you to read. Just take a few minutes to read it. Okay, does anybody speak this language? I hope nobody. I hope this is brand new for all of you because it's a made-up language. Now, here's the first question I would like you to answer. What was the Flester doing? Was the Flester chandering? Was the Flester galigning, or was the Flester wrangling? So put your responses in the chat box, A, B, or C. Okay, I'm getting lots of galigning and B. Absolutely. Yep. Excellent. Now, isn't it amazing that none of you speak this language and yet you got the correct response? The answer is indeed B. Okay, here's your second question, the same passage, same reading passage. Now, the question is, where was the Flester? Was the Flester begrant the Quistly? Was the Flester besant chander, or was the Flester begrant the bruck? Okay, again, in the chat box, give me your answer, A, B, or C. Okay, absolutely. Yep. Lots of you are saying C. A few of you have chosen A, but actually the correct response is indeed C. Excellent. Moving on. Same passage, third question. And so far, all of you got everything perfectly correct. You got 100% on both questions, which is amazing. What is the event described here? Is it A, the flesher is participating in a sports competition? B, the flesher is cooking a special meal for friends? Or C, the flesher is ill in hospital? Okay, again, responses to question number 3, please, in the chat box. So I'm getting question marks. Some people are saying A, others are saying C. There are lots of question marks. People saying, I don't know, can't be said, no idea, not possible to tell. It is possible to tell if you speak the language. Okay, final question for you. Here's the fourth and final question. What do you think the writer will say to the flesher later when she wrangles him? How did the dinner go? A. B. Did all go well with your operation? Or C. Did you win the race? Again, what do you think? What is the response to question 4? Okay, some people are saying B, others are saying C. I like it how C seems to be a widespread answer. No appropriate answer, says someone else. A question mark. It depends on your response to the previous question. Exactly. And Sabina just says, I don't know. And it's true, actually, unless you can understand more than just a few words in this passage, you wouldn't know what the answer is. So I've given you a taste of reading. And let's now think what would make this a good task and what would make it a good communicative task. But first of all, what is the difference between questions 1 and 2 and questions 3 and 4? Why could you answer perfectly questions 1 and 2 without speaking this language, but you couldn't answer questions 3 and 4? What do you think is the difference? Have a little thought, put some responses in the chat box. Okay, so people are saying 1 and 2 are based on grammar. Some people are saying it's about context versus understand, context, which is about the broader picture. Keywords, there's no scope to guess. You can't guess. So syntax and vocabulary are coming up a lot. And questions 3 and 4, others are saying, are asking about semantic meaning. So they're asking about something that is a little bit more than just individual words. Grammatical awareness and syntactic knowledge. Okay, and someone says in questions 1 and 2, we can understand a few words and respond. Questions 3 and 4, you have to understand the whole passage. And that actually is the key difference between the two. And it is all about cognitive processes. It is all about the processes needed to be triggered in your brain when you're doing reading comprehension. That is the construct. If you remember, we talked about construct. Communicative language ability is one of our constructs. Within that, reading ability is another construct. So let's think about what are those cognitive processes that are triggered when you engage in reading. So here's the theory about cognitive processing in reading. We go from the bottom up, okay? So some are seen as lower level, some are seen as high level processes. We start with the visual input, that's the passage. And then we recognize words. We access the lexes that we have, and we do some syntactic parsing to understand how the different bits of the sentence are broken up and how the ideas are broken up. And then we establish the propositional meaning at the clause and sentence level. So this is lower level cognitive processing. This is it's fundamental, but it only takes you up to a certain position within the processing that is triggered in real life reading. And to do this, you need to have syntactic knowledge, you need to have lexical knowledge of meaning and form. This is what you were doing really, really well when you were answering questions 1 and 2. However, reading is not just about that. Reading is not just about stopping at propositional meaning at the clause or sentence level. Reading is about going beyond that and making inferences, building a mental model which enhances your proposition, your understanding of the sentences, and then you create a text level representation. In other words, you understand what the text means, not just the individual words within that text or the individual syntactic chunks within the text. This is high level cognitive processes. This is what happens in real life reading. We all do this all the time. We also do it based on what kind of reading we're doing. This is our goal setting. What goal do we set ourselves in order to read successfully? So maybe we do careful reading, which means that you're focusing on the details of a passage. And that careful reading can be local, you understand sentences, and global, you understand the main ideas, so you go beyond the sentences. Or the reading can maybe be expeditious, that means more speeded, fast, you don't need to focus on details. And it can be local when you're scanning for specifics, or global when you're skimming for gist. So different kinds of reading are involved in these cognitive processes. Let's think about, so I've taken some of the cognitive processes here. Let's think about our questions. So word recognition, lexis, syntax, and so on. Questions 1 and 2 covered this level of processing. So you stopped at establishing propositional meaning at the clause and sentence level. And you could do it because there were some clues about lexis and about syntax. If something ended in ing, that was a clue, it's a verb. There were other clues about adverbs and so on because of word order. Questions 3 and 4 were about inferencing and creating a text level representation. In terms of kinds of reading, questions 1 and 2 are about careful reading at the local level, in other words, understanding sentences. Questions 3 and 4 were about reading at the global level, understanding ideas, overall text, and inferences. So the point here is that this reading task, imagine this was part of a communicative test, was a really good one because it covered both local reading and global reading. It activated, it needed to activate cognitive processes covering both lower level processing and high level processing. Some students would have performed very well at both if they understood more of the passage. Others would have performed very well just at questions 1 and 2. But the point is, both these cognitive processes were reflected in this task, which was in turn reflective of what real life reading is all about. So that's what communicative is. It's not just about speaking, it's about what happens in real life reading, what cognitive processes are generated as part of a task. Really important though, a key point for you to take away is that we talked about construct validity very quickly, about the construct validity of a reading task here. No test is valid or not valid. No test is good or bad. We couldn't say this is a good or bad task. It depends on the purpose of that task. So tests are always valid for a specific purpose. So just to say something is valid is nonsense. You have to say valid for what? So this was a valid task, the one that we just did together, for a communicative reading test, because it tapped into a range of cognitive processes which are found in real life. So we've talked very quickly, and this is all very quick, just to give you a taste of things. We've talked about context validity, what a task looks like, and cognitive validity, the cognitive processes that a task triggers. This, of course, is not enough. You have to score the test. You have to score your communicative test. So scoring validity is just as important. And another word for that often is reliability. They work together. These three are always in a trio, in a pyramid. You cannot separate them. And you always, in a communicative test or any test, you have to think of the context validity considerations, which is the task characteristics, the cognitive validity, how a cognitive process is triggered, and how you're going to score your test. There are other aspects of construct validity I won't talk about, but I just wanted to show them to you on the screen. You have to think about the test taker characteristics, the consequential validity aspects, which is test impact, and how your test aligns to other criteria, such as frameworks and so on. So let's think about reliability a little bit, because we haven't talked about this yet. Every time you talk about test qualities of validity and reliability, every single time, it's a balancing act. In other words, if one gets emphasized, the other one has to be given special attention, because it is often there's a tension there. So if we want to emphasize reliability, in other words, very, very, very high objectivity, as we saw in the psychometric era in the 1960s, that impacts on the kinds of tasks used, because having authentic tasks that have strong context validity and cognitive validity considerations means that you have to introduce speaking and writing. It means that you need to be involving human examiners. It means that you need task types that are not so easy to score. Now, there's a tension. It is obviously something that is doable in terms of balancing that tension, but you have to give specific attention to this in communicative tests. So if you want to achieve high reliability of scoring, that results in narrow tasks, such as, for example, complete a sentence, read aloud, describe a picture. They're much more narrow than communicative tasks, such as write an essay, participate in a face-to-face interactional test, understand main ideas across texts. That's much more challenging to do if you want to achieve high reliability. Now, communicative tests do have this tension, and that's very much part of what they are, but there are, of course, ways to deal with this. So here's another task for you, just to think about reliability a little bit. I've got a picture of an apple. If we were doing this face-to-face, I would bring an apple for you, but now I can't. So here's a picture of an apple. Your task is very simple. Grade this apple. 6 is highest, 1 is lowest. So on a scale of 1 to 6, give this apple a grade. That's all I'm going to tell you. So just grade this apple and give it a score 1 to 6. Okay, I'm seeing a 2.5, I'm seeing 6, and lots of, oh, even a 1. We've got a very harsh rater here. So anything really from 1 to 6, with the majority of scores going in the 3, 4, and 5 category. Okay, now, if I wanted you, I threw you into this. Just grade an apple, I didn't give you any information about it. How could I have made you more reliable? Because you are, if you're my raters in this test, you're completely unstandardized. We've got marks ranging from 1 to 6, or even, from 3 to 5. That's still quite a big range. What could I do to make you a bit more standardized in grading this apple? Okay, Gail says we need criteria for what we're rating. That's right. So you need criteria, rubrics, training, comparing other apples, exactly the comparability aspect. We need examples of different apples and how they're rated. Other people saying rubrics. Someone said earlier on, we need to taste it. I love that, yes, because apples are, the real life function of apples is to be eaten. So you need to have a taste of them, comparisons, a definition of what's a good apple from Mike B, and so on. Absolutely. So this is just a taste view of what test reliability is and how challenging it is in a communicative test, because a communicative test involves speaking and writing, which means the human element has to be addressed. So here's, you've mentioned this already. I'll just summarize it for you. Here's how we can deal with reliability in a communicative test. The test design actually is very important, because the kind of test you use and the design use could support uniform marking. And it could also tap into different aspects of the construct, let's say different aspects of speaking, that would allow some to be a bit more objectively measured than others. Assessment scales describing the construct. So what is an apple? What is fluency? What is interactional competence? What is organization in writing? So describing the construct in assessment scales. You need trained examiners to take those scales and put them into practice, and you need ongoing monitoring of your examiners, because you cannot just train examiners and assume that they're going to be marking to standard forever. That is not the case. So they need regular, constant monitoring and retraining in order to perform well. This, of course, takes a lot of effort. So if you offer a communicative test, you need to invest in elements like these, which do help with the reliability of the test and balance the tension of communicative tasks and also adequate and acceptable reliability of the test. And needless to say, in Cambridge, we fully believe in putting investment in examiners, because we do believe that writing and speaking have to be part of the test. Okay, just very quickly, rounding up here. I've talked about communicative testing, what it is, how we've gotten here. You've had a taste of the test design, cognitive processes, reliability, and so on. Just two current trends and debates in communicative testing I want to finish with. The first one is technology, very much part of our lives, even more now, as we've all been working from home during this pandemic. Technology is having a massive impact on language assessment and on teaching, of course, as well. Technology has an expansive influence on language assessment and on communicative language assessment, because it leads to new task types. You can, for example, include an integrated task as part of your communicative test. Let's say this is a test of academic English. You can have a task where you give a reading passage to your test takers, something to listen to, and then you ask them to write about it. That's an integrated task, reading, listening into writing. or you can get them to listen to something and then talk about it. Another integrated task, speaking into listening into speaking. This is not possible without technology. So multimodal tasks, integrated tasks are made possible by technology, and they're a fantastic new addition to the portfolio of tasks which are possible. Automated scoring of writing and speaking is another development that technology has enabled, and automated test delivery in speaking. So a computer delivered speaking test, and then that test can be marked by machine or marked by or marked in a hybrid way by a machine and a human being. Technology enables this, and I think it's a very positive development. It has, though, also reductive influence on communicative testing. And the reductive influence is that technology is limited. Technology cannot deal with communication in speaking. So very often, if technology is the driving force behind the test design, that becomes a non-communicative test design, because we can have a dialogue task. No interaction task is possible. Or a writing task where you're focusing on content, developing main ideas and details. Machines are limited in that. So they do affect the features that can be assessed. So narrow range of assessed features is another result of using technology, or at least the way technology is now, and also lack of interactional tests. So if you use technology in your test, by default, that means the speaking is computer delivered. So we need to find a balance between the reductive and expansive influence of technology in communicative test, and a lot of organizations are doing that already. Integration of learning and assessment, that's the second trend I wanted to flag up for you when it comes to communicative testing. These are getting integrated much more. It is no longer the case that you learn, you stop, you test. Now they're integrated into one experience, with testing and learning happening pretty much at the same time. Diagnostic testing is part of this, so giving very precise feedback as part of your communicative test to your test takers, and ongoing behind the scenes assessment. So, you know, all the information that you're doing through this journey of learning and assessment is feeding into your profile, and that is behind the scenes assessment for you. Okay, so just to recap quickly, communicative language assessment, I've tried to cover a whole range of concepts here. I hope they've made sense, but here's what we focused on. So language use is the focus when it comes to communicative language assessment. It's not just about speaking, it's about language use in authentic context, in authentic tasks. So the test design has to be based on, you know, tasks that you find outside of the classroom or the test room. Broad construct definition, so we're not limited by very narrow tasks, and we have to balance test qualities in any test, whether it's communicative or not. Reliability, validity, impact have to be balanced. In a communicative test, that is even more so the case, because it becomes more challenging to do that. Okay, I've just have some references for you if you want to read a bit more on some of the things I've talked about. This is further information about the course itself, the Master of Studies, inquiries email, and there's a virtual open day next month at 9 o'clock British Summer Time that you can register at following these links. And I shall end by saying thank you so much for listening and for engaging so wonderfully with the tasks. And we will now open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Evelina. It's brilliant. Whilst we're waiting for a few questions to come into the Q&A, I noticed a couple earlier which were just querying whether it's going to be recorded. So yes, it's absolutely being recorded, and we will make sure you have the link so you can revisit it, and also revisit that lovely reference page on Evelina's presentation as well, so you can do some further reading if you want to. And then the other question that I noticed pop up was about certificates. So for this session, as an individual session, no, there's not a certificate. It's simply the lovely opportunity really to hear more about communicative language assessment. For the MST, as distinct from that, is a Master of Studies degree at the University of Cambridge. So Master of Studies is the equivalent of an MA or an MPhil, but it's studied part-time over 2 years. And that's why it's called an MST. It's a peculiarity. But Emma, do we have any other questions? Oh, look, fantastic. Thank you. See some now. So just one for you, Evelina, I believe. So do you think that current speaking assessment practices are evolving more towards the paired and group formats rather than the individual ones?
Great question, Mehmet. I would say it really depends on the purpose. It depends on what you're trying to assess and the practicalities around it. So if you are focus much more on a school environment, I would say a school context, then yes, there is an evolution towards paired and group contexts, because that's actually what happens in the classroom and we're reflecting the classroom practices. But if your context is, let's say, employability, you need a quick decision to make about somebody, whether they're to be invited for an interview or not, whether they can exit their course of study at university, then maybe an individual speaking format is more appropriate, because that's actually a bit more easy to organize, and it still gives you access to interactional skills. So it really depends on the context, I would say.
Fantastic. And following on from that, and we will come back to Sabina's question in a minute as well, but what do you think about PTE, or speaking parts exams?
I'm sorry, PTE meaning the Pearson Test of English?
I presume so.
Okay, so
yes.
okay, the Pearson Test of English. Okay, the Pearson Test of English is a fully automated speaking test. In other words, everything in the speaking test is delivered by machine and it is marked by machine. So I would say, going back to the point I made about technology, that's a test that is very much reduced by what technology can do. And it's limited in its design because it has to fit around what the technology can measure. So the task types are very narrow. You read something, you hear something, and you repeat it. You describe a picture, and you answer questions with 1 or 2 words. So very, very, very narrow. And I would say that is not a communicative test. It's not a test that taps broadly into communicative construct.
Thank you. And then Sabina's asked, how is the course organized? And so I can perhaps answer a little bit, and Evelina, please do feel free to add in if you wish to. So the MST, as I've said, is over 2 years. And actually on the 20th of July, our course director, Dr. Roberto Saleo, will be speaking more to the kind of detail of the course structure. But essentially there are 2 main residential periods when you'll be expected to attend in Cambridge face-to-face for 2 weeks, the first of which will be at the end of March 2022. The course begins in January. There's 6 modules of sort of teaching content, and you have your dissertation as well. In both the residential sessions, you will be covering kind of information from the various modules, and you'll be it's very exciting actually, because you'll be in Cambridge and you'll be meeting people from Cambridge Assessment. You'll go into Cambridge Assessment English, and you'll study potentially at Madden in Fitzwilliam College as well. So for information more relating to kind of learning outcomes and what you get from the various bits, if you look at our course page, which I think Amy's really helpfully put into the chat there, that's brilliant, and come to the webinar on the 20th of July. Evelina, did you want to add anything at all?
No, just that it's very exciting. I can feel Zara's enthusiasm for this, and so can I.
No, it's really good, and yeah, no, it's very exciting moment when the course is. Every time I hear more about what's going to happen, it's brilliant. So I hope you enjoy it too. And I think we've got a few more questions here as well.
We do. I can take them. Okay, so this is a question from Savas. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Talking about how the same examiner, he or she says, 5 examiners look at a piece of performance, speaking, writing, and then they give different marks. How can we make examiners mark more in unison? It really is all about the 4 things I listed. It's about the test design. So are there some tasks that are maybe more challenging to mark versus easier to mark? So do you have a description of a picture versus an interaction, a paired task that you have to mark? So that would take some of the burden off the examiners if it's not all interaction for 12 minutes, but there's some description, some Q&A. So test design, and it is also about defining very precisely what you want your examiners to be marking. So defining the construct in assessment scales, the descriptors, the phrases that you use in those assessment scales have to be really clear so that your examiners understand, and they understand them in the same way, providing a lot of examples to exemplify what those descriptors mean, and really focusing a lot on training. It's a big investment. You have to invest a lot in your examiners, giving them lots of chances to train, to retrain, to recertify, and they're always going to be, there will always be disagreement though. So even though even if you put a lot of all the time in the world in training, you should never ever expect full agreement, and that's okay. Because they're human beings, they're not machines. And we have human beings in the speaking test or the writing test because we want them to bring a slightly different perspective. So some disagreement is fine. If you get your examiners to agree too much, that means they're agreeing on superficial, meaningless things, such as in writing, let's say, handwriting. If they're agreeing too much, that means they're focusing on something that is not the full construct. So training, very important, assessment skills, test design, but also accept the fact that there'll be some disagreement. It just has to be acceptable within acceptable boundaries.
I think in terms of the next one, I think we've got to be more communicative. What would you suggest? And this is specifically referencing speaking and writing assessment.
I would say, well, first of all, include speaking and writing in your test, because actually a lot of organizations don't, because it is much easier not to. So, you know, the 1960s that I talked about, the psychromatic era, multiple choice is queen, objectivity is king. It's also about much practicality is king as well. It's much easier not to do speaking and writing. Include speaking and writing. And then think about what speaking tasks happen in the real world, what writing tasks happen in the real world. Include those in your tests. So if we take speaking, for example, do we just, you know, in your context, you know, what is your context? If it is, for example, school context, where it's a very broad understanding of language, we give presentations, we talk to other classmates in a group of 2, we participate in groups, we talk to the teacher only. Outside of the classroom, you know, it's all of these different configurations of speaking. Include all of those. The same with writing. What kinds of writing are being done in the context you're interested in? Include that in your test. And do, if I can just add quickly, do a little bit of piloting of those tasks, because you might think they work, maybe they don't. So always gather a bit of evidence about how well your tasks are performing, and you can tweak based on that little bit of trialing or piloting that you've done as a teacher in your design.
Brilliant. And if we skip to just because it kind of follows on, if you could give some more examples of how to make reading assessment more communicative as well.
Okay, well, it is exactly, I'm going to repeat the same thing, but the question is, what kinds of reading happen in real life? And I want, you know, include those kinds of reading in your test. What is it? Is it reading carefully? Is it careful reading at the local level? So that means at the sentence level. Is it reading globally beyond the sentence? Is it reading for gist? You know, think about what is it that your learners are engaging with. Bring that into your test and try to trigger a range of cognitive processing. So you need to know a little bit what you're going for. And that is it just the sentence level, or does it go beyond the sentence? So that task I did with you on reading, that should be your little proxy for the kinds of questions that you can be asking. And communicative also means it has a purpose. So what happens in real life? We read for a purpose. What is the purpose of that reading? Make that purpose clear to your test takers, clear to your learners. You're reading this because you want to then tell somebody about it, or you're reading this because you know, that purpose should be very clear in the task itself.
Definitely. And then also sort of following on from that, is writing always a higher cognitive level, would you say, or not?
It doesn't have to be. It really depends on your learners, on your test takers, on your context. You can have young learners. You just want them to write a sentence of 3 words, okay? Or you just want them to write 2 words. That's writing for that age group. That's really good writing for that age group. So it depends on who your learners are. In an academic English context, yes, you want essays, you want passages, you want describing a graph or something like that. For young learners, that's not the case. So it depends on who your test takers are. And if I can just give a quick example, in the Cambridge test for young learners, we've got a fantastic example of learning principles embedded. So we're scaffolding our learners. They're, you know, kids 9, 10 years old. They start with very little, just write a word, then they write a sentence, and then they write a few sentences. So that scaffolding and progression is really important as well.
Fantastic. And building on what the university is doing, I mean, are you working with technology producers and coders to improve AI test assessment for speaking and writing?
We are. So Zara mentioned at the beginning the Alta Institute, which is automated, using AI in learning and assessment. We are. We have a test, which is one of the Cambridge tests that is fully automated. It's called LinguaSkills, so machine delivered, machine assessed, used in certain contexts, not in the school's context that, you know, we have our other tests. So yes, we're very much looking into that, where we believe, though, in using technology responsibly. So in other words, using it in a way that is expansive and not reductive. And still technology has limitations. So we're exploring ways that we can really add value through using technology in our tests.
And on that technological vein, do you know any type of assessment tool or platform on communication based on AI and machine learning? I think I got that question right.
Not really, to be honest, because machines are not advanced enough to deal with dialogue in an assessment context. In an assessment context is very, very high stakes. You need to be sure that you're using technology that can manage the unpredictability of conversation, the technologies that can manage the co-constructed nature of conversation. And that doesn't exist. You can use it in a learning context, though. Even using Alexa or Siri on your phone can do some kind of dialogue with your learners, but not in assessment context. I would say I don't know of any provider that uses dialogic systems in their tests, just because they're not developed enough yet.
Fantastic. I'm going to switch into a couple of kind of more logistical questions before we come back to some of the kind of thoughts and questions. What will be covered in the open day in July? As I say, Dr. Roberto Cilio will be going into a little bit more detail about the content covered in the various modules and how that will be structured within the residential sessions, and then really thinking about how our virtual learning environment and the work you do throughout the course interacts with those residential sessions. And Anna Maria, the course it's a mixture. So for the 2 residential sessions, we expect students to attend face-to-face in Cambridge. As we've seen over the past year, things can change. And we will, of course, make sure that all students can achieve their learning outcomes. But if you're thinking of signing up for the course, please anticipate attending face-to-face in Cambridge for the 2 two-week residential sessions, one of which is the end of March 2022, and the following one will be a similar time of year in 2023. But you will then have a lot of possible various tasks and interaction and recorded lectures available on our virtual learning environment throughout the course. It won't just be you have 2 weeks and that's it. You'll be creating a sense of sharing your learning experiences. So after those, I think if we go to Isabel's question, which is, you mentioned, Evelina, mostly reading, writing and speaking tasks as testing communicative skills, but Cambridge also has a use of English papers in their main suite exams. So how would you consider them?
It's a very good question, but doesn't have an easy answer, to be honest, Isabel. There's no right and wrong way of going about this. You can have a communicative test that also focuses on grammar and vocabulary separately, or not. So IELTS, for example, is one of our tests where we don't have a separate grammar and vocabulary component. That's embedded in the 4 skills. In the Cambridge test, we do have a separate component. It's just how we've approached it. The key point is the test shouldn't stop just with grammar and vocabulary. It really should go beyond that. And you can have it as a separate part of the exam or not, but it needs to go beyond that. When it comes to measurement accuracy, focusing just on grammar and vocabulary actually is quite a good predictor of language ability. In other words, you can really get to much more specific nuances of language, and you can test much more precise knowledge of grammar and vocabulary if you have a separate grammar and vocabulary paper than if you embed it in speaking and writing. So that's one advantage of having a separate one, that it gives you a bit more control over what you're targeting through grammar and vocabulary.
And on that kind of idea of targeting, I think Julian sort of said in his teaching context, candidates feel the assessment is not only of, say, communicative writing or speaking, but also partly an ability to come up with and express original opinions, which culturally they feel is different from their way of looking at things. So, for example, write about 2 cafes, one you like and one you don't like. Have you got any comments on that?
Well, so this is presuming this is a culture where cafes are not part of it. Is that possibly part of the question? Again, your questions are pushing me. That's really, really good. An international test really needs to be culturally neutral. It shouldn't be advantaging one cultural viewpoint over another. And that's what Cambridge tries to do, just because we do offer international tests taken by millions of people from a range of cultures around the world. So we try to be as internationally neutral as possible. And so the choice of topics is really important. And we really shouldn't be including, we try not to include questions or topics that we think are maybe sensitive in certain cultures. Having said that, I think when you prepare for a test, it's always good to be pushed in your thinking, actually. And research on test preparation for IELTS, for example, shows us that some test takers welcome the chance to start discussing topics that they wouldn't normally discuss in their own culture. And so you have to approach test design sensitively and not disadvantage any learners or test takers through topics that would be culturally, foreign to them. But at the same time, I think there's something good about exposing them to a range of topics that makes them become better thinkers as human beings at the same time.
Fantastic. And Julian's, so because it was actually also about the idea of expressing opinions, but as you just finished answering,
Yes.
you covered that in your kind of the idea of stretching people.
Yeah. And can I just add just about expressing opinions, and then it depends on your on your approach. You could choose not to mark for content, which is a bit of a gray area. So you're focusing just on linguistic aspects of the response, not on the content, not the quality of the opinion. But of course, that you have to express an opinion. I think that it's important to be asking for opinions.
And then a kind of statement, or do you agree with this? I suppose, at higher levels of speaking and writing, the language can sometimes feel artificial. So advanced grammar or lexis squeezed in. So arguably, the higher language becomes less communicative.
I know what Mike means here. Yes, in a way. Grammar and vocabulary cannot be stretched over, let's say, 10 bands. And as you get to a certain sophisticated level of grammar and vocabulary, that's already, there are more bands to cover beyond that. So I think there's still breadth of lexis and vocabulary we can tap into at higher levels. That is about nuance, it's about collocations, it's about complexity in sentences. But at the same time, in a way, what sometimes we're listing at the very high levels is not just grammar and vocabulary, but it's about opinions and content. And then you start at those high levels, you start seeing this fusion of language, grammar and vocabulary, and content and ideas. And that's a bit of an unsolvable question, actually.
And then finally, so from Anna Maria, so can we consider asking to answer an email in 30 words based on given aspects to refer too guided to be considered higher cognitive level?
I think it, in a way, length doesn't matter. You can have an email in 30 words, which does tap into high cognitive processes, because it could be about, 30 words, you can have a main idea, you can have some details supporting it. So that would still be tapping into high level cognitive processes. Or just think of this, you can have a reading. So I know the question is about writing, but reading, you can have, the answer can be one word. You read a passage and you define it or you describe it with one word or a title, 3 words. That taps into the highest level of cognitive processing, but the response is very short. So just think of what you have to do. Do you have to understand just words, individual sentences, or more? Same with writing. Do you have to write something that is a sentence or something that has to cohere together? Then it taps into a range of processes.
That makes sense. I think unless anybody has any further questions, oh, hang on, there's one more. Oh no, that's a thank you from Anna Maria, no problem at all. Unless anybody has any further questions, I think we have probably just about on time as well reached the end of our webinar. So all that remains really, hang on, let me just check again. Yeah, concise and clear is challenging. Yes, it is, Julian. Really all that remains is to say thank you ever so much to Dr. Evelina Galaczi for a really inspiring talk today and sharing of ideas as well. It's been fantastic. So we will make sure everyone gets a copy of the recording so you can revisit, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Of course, this wouldn't happen without you. So we really appreciate your interest in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.